It started with a tension in the air, the kind that sinks deep and heavy into your bones, making everything else around you feel surreal. I stood there, just outside the house, admiring the gift that had cost us months of saving and planning, a pickup truck shimmering under the luar, fading afternoon light. My grandfather would never expect this. He'd been a security guard for as long as I could remember, patrolling the endless desert stretches in that old rickety sedan. He called his loyal friend. This new truck would mean the world to him. Maybe as much as the promise he'd made to leave his two-story house in my name. It felt like a gesture of thanks, a recognition of all the years he'd poured into protecting us, his family. "Are you going to show him already?" My father asked, grinning. He patted my shoulder, proud, as we ran through the features on the truck one last time. The sleek body, the sturdy tires fit for the rugged terrain. It was everything he'd need out there. For a second, I allowed myself to picture his reaction, the shock, the grateful smile. I knew this would hit him right in the heart. I got home just as the sun began dipping below the horizon. The soft chime of voices reached me as I unlocked the door, and I felt that odd sensation of something being just out of place. It wasn't until I stepped inside that I realized I hadn't been imagining it. There in our bedroom, my wife was talking quietly on the phone. She hadn't noticed me yet. Her back turned as she sat cross-legged on the bed, a small smile dancing on her lips as she whispered into the phone. I froze, listening, but all I caught were faint fragments, enough to piece together that she was speaking with someone familiar. "Oh, I wish I could, but tomorrow," she said, letting out a soft sigh. Then a laugh, short and almost affectionate. "No, really, it's his grandfather's birthday. I can't miss it." I knew she must have been speaking to one of her friends. The usual crew she kept close, always in each other's lives, calling and texting at all hours. She'd often told me about their plans, the way they'd gather for wine or late-night vending sessions about work, sharing life's small grievances and joys alike. This call, though, seemed oddly different. There was a warmth in her voice that felt misplaced. I shrugged it off, forced myself to shake the thought from my mind, as she turned, surprised to see me. Her smile brightened instantly, any tension slipping from Ming. Her face as she rose and wrapped her arms around me, her embrace warm and genuine. "There you are." I was starting to worry. She murmured against my chest, her voice light. "Just getting everything ready," I said, brushing it off. "Tomorrow's going to be something, isn't it?" She nodded, her gaze flickering for a split second before returning to mine. That same soft warmth there again. "It really will be." As she pulled away to head back into the bedroom, I felt a strange pain I couldn't place. Perhaps it was the pressure of making everything perfect for tomorrow, or maybe it was that small moment of laughter on the phone that had felt too intimate. It was nothing, I told myself, forcing a laugh. Tomorrow would be about family, about my grandfather, and finally giving back in a way that mattered. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept rolling onto my side, eyes darting open at the smallest sounds, a cart engine down the street, the hum of the refrigerator kicking on. It was all nerves, I told myself, just the excitement and strain of tomorrow, the payoff of months of planning. My mind wouldn't stop circling around the anticipation of my grandfather's face when he saw the truck, the pride I'd feel standing there, beside him, watching him inspect every detail. But somewhere in the restless dark, exhaustion finally won. I fell under, pulled into a sleep that felt thick like it swallowed me whole. The dream came on like a slideshow, surreal but familiar. I was there, just like I had pictured, holding the truck keys and feeling my chest swell with that same pride. My grandfather stood in front of me, his face weathered but lit up like a child's, a smile that I hadn't seen in years, stretching across his face. "Go on, take it for a spin," I told him, handing him the keys. His hand wrapped around mine, his grip strong and grateful. For a moment it was perfect. Then out of nowhere, my wife was there. She appeared beside him, draping herself over his shoulder in a way that felt wrong, even in the half-light of a dream. She leaned into him, her hand on his chest, her fingers drawing small circles over the fabric of his shirt as if to tease him, to draw him in. I wanted to shake myself to make sense of what I was seeing, but I felt rooted in place. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. She laughed a slow, quiet laugh that seemed to echo, mocking me as she slid her hand lower. And my grandfather just stood there, frozen, not moving, not reacting, but letting her linger like he was powerless to stop her. I tried to shout to pull her back, but my voice caught, locked in my throat. Everything in me tensed, my frustration boiling over, my mind screaming even though I was voiceless in the dream. She kept touching him, caressing his face, her fingers brushing over his lips, over his neck. My stomach turned, the air thick with something I couldn't explain, like I was drowning, and my feet were sinking glued to the ground. I tried to wake up, to force myself out of the nightmare, but I couldn't. Then I was screaming. Finally, a long, frustrated shout ripped out of me, raw and desperate, echoing until it jerked me. Awake. The room was dark, but I was gasping, clawing for air as if I just surfaced from deep, underwater. My heart hammered against my chest, sweat sticking my back to the sheets. I blinked, trying to shake the lingering horror that felt as thick and clinging as a film over my skin. Then, in the faint moonlight, I saw her. My wife, sitting up in bed, her face etched with something I couldn't quite read, half fear, half shock. She was watching me, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open like she was afraid to move. "What did you dream?" she whispered, her voice soft, almost trembling. I felt my pulse throb as I stared at her, trying to steady my breathing, to bring myself back to the present, back to reality. I told her everything I had seen. I managed forcing my voice steady, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure myself. She held my gaze for a second longer. Then suddenly she laughed. It was the same laugh as in the dream. Light but strange, edged with something mocking, something that made my skin crawl all over again. "How could you dream something so ridiculous?" she said, shaking her head as she settled back into her pillow, her laughter fading into the dark like it had left a trail in the air. I lay back, beside her, staring at the ceiling, the echo of her laugh crawling into the corners of my mind. The morning came too quickly, and I sank into a heavy, restless sleep. I was still haunted by fragments of the dream, echoing in the back of my mind. Even in the bright light, filtering through the curtains, the unease from last night clung to me like a fog I couldn't shake. A soft touch on my shoulder jolted me out of the depths of sleep. My wife stood over me, her face calm and unreadable, a slight smile on her lips. "Honey, get up, we're going to your grandfather's in an hour," she said, her voice smooth and gentle, as if everything about last night's dream had melted away into thin air. I blinked, letting her words sink in, and forced myself to sit up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. It was already 11 a.m. I shook my head, trying to rid myself of the fog that still hung there, those strange fragments of last night's nightmare still clinging to me. I took a deep breath, grounding myself. This was real. Today was real. The truck, the gift, my grandfather's birthday. I'd been waiting for this day for months, and I wasn't going to let the remnants of some absurd dream ruin it. I got ready in silence, washing up and dressing carefully, trying to push myself fully into the present. My father arrived just as I was finishing. I could hear him outside, his voice a steady hum as he admired the new pickup in the driveway. I gave myself one last look in the mirror, hoping the remnants of sleep had faded from my face, and then joined them outside. "Look at this beauty," my father said, patting the side of the truck with pride. His grin was wide, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "This is going to knock your grandfather's boots right off," he chuckled, sliding into the driver's seat of the truck, ready to lead the way. With a deep breath, I slid into our car beside my wife, her hand resting lightly on my arm as she smiled, as if nothing at all were out of place. I nodded, my pulse settling into the steady rhythm of the road ahead. We pulled out of the driveway, the two cars humming side by side, and soon we were on the open road, our car trailing behind. The pickup, a smooth hour-long drive into the Texas desert stretching ahead of us. As we drove, the vast open landscape rolled out before us, empty fields under an endless sky. The house sat alone out there like a part of the desert itself, resilient and timeless. My anticipation built with each mile, along with a strange sense of nostalgia. I'd been out here many times before, but today felt different. It felt like a threshold, like we were on the verge of something bigger. A new chapter, just waiting to be written. As we pulled up to my grandfather's house, I could see him standing in the doorway, shading his eyes against the bright Texas sun. He squinted, watching as the two cars rolled to a stop in his dusty driveway. I could tell he'd noticed the pickup right away. His face lit up, and he took a few steps forward, his eyes glued to us, inspecting every inch of it as we climbed out. My father stepped out of the truck with a smirk, gesturing proudly to the pickup like he'd just driven off a dealer's lot. "Well, what do you think of my new ride?" he said, patting the hood with that look of satisfaction I'd seen on his face 100 times. My grandfather raised his brows, giving my date a look that was somewhere between admiration and envy. He ran his hand over the side of the truck, nodding approvingly, but with a touch of jealousy, just barely visible in his eyes. "Looks like a real beauty," he said, his voice gruff but quiet, almost as if speaking too loud would break whatever spell he felt standing there in front of it. That was my moment. I took a step forward, unable to hold back a grin. "Congratulations, Grandpa," I said, my voice catching slightly from the excitement I'd been holding in. "This is your pickup. We bought it for you. All your paperwork's inside, so it's officially yours." For a second, he just stared at me, stunned, his eyes wide, uncomprehending. His hand froze on the truck, and I could see his mind working to make sense of what I'd just said. When it hit him, his expression shifted. His hand went to his face and he let out a breath, his shoulders dropping as if the weight of the years had just been lifted. A tear glistened in his eye, though he'd never let it fall. "Mine," he repeated, his voice so soft I almost couldn't hear him. I nodded, and he took a step back, wiping his eyes, the pride and joy on his face saying more than any words ever could. Just then, a few cars rolled up, kicking up dust as our other guests arrived. They were close family friends, just 6 people, but they meant the world to him. He beamed as each one stepped out, shaking hands and clapping him on the back, a mixture of laughter and music filling the air as a speaker crackled, alive with some old country tunes. The afternoon unfolded like a scene I knew I'd remember forever. Drinks flowed, stories were told, and everyone, my grandfather especially, let loose, caught up in the joy and freedom of that endless stretch of land around us. I watched him drift toward the truck every few minutes, as if checking to make sure it was real, running his hand over it like he still couldn't believe it was his. I glanced over at my wife, who caught my eye and smiled back, her gaze soft and warm, as though she could feel my relief, my happiness. She laughed easily with the others, her face bright and carefree, raising her glass as the afternoon wore on, clinking it with mine. Everything felt perfect in that rare, fragile way that can't be planned or forced. We had given my grandfather something more than just a truck that day. We'd given him a part of himself back. The party had picked up in full force, music pouring out into the open air, laughter and conversation mingling with the occasional shout and clink of glasses. I watched as the handful of guests danced and swayed, each person caught up in the heat of the moment, in the freedom that comes with leaving worries behind for an afternoon. I felt it too, the satisfaction of having made this day everything my grandfather had deserved and more. He sat off to the side now, talking with an old friend, his new truck still visible from where he sat. Every now and then, he glanced over at it with a look of disbelief, and it was that look that told me we'd given him something money alone could never buy. My wife was nearby, her cheeks flushed from the drink. She'd had a laugh on her lips, her glass half-tipped in her hand. She'd loosened up more than usual, her balance starting to betray her as she laughed and stumbled, swaying even when the music slowed. I noticed her blink, her expression softening as her eyes grew heavier. Then she looked over at me and slurred. "I think I need to lie down for a bit." I nodded, understanding. She rarely drank this much, and the day had been a lot for everyone. She slipped inside, weaving her way through the screen door and disappearing into the house. I watched her go, then returned to the group, letting the thumping beat of the music pull me back into the moment. Not long after, my father clapped me on the back, nearly knocking the drink from my hand. He laughed, his face red, his words a little slurred as he swayed beside me. "She's not the only one who overdid it today." He chuckled. "I'm gonna go find a place to crash for, a bit too. Think I'll lie down next to her." I barely glanced at him. "Sure, Dad," I said, nodding. "Take a rest. After all, what was there to worry about?" My wife and my father were 2 harmless drunks in need of a nap, and my grandfather's bedroom was far enough from the fourth party that they'd be able to rest undisturbed. I figured they'd be out cold for a while, and it was probably better for them to sit out the rest of the day. I watched him make his way into the house, still chuckling to himself, and turned back to the party. The sun was beginning to casting a warm amber light over everything, the sky stretching wide and golden above us. The moment felt like one of those rare times when life slows down, when everything feels just as it should be. I was still riding the high of knowing my grandfather was happy, that he'd be taken care of with his new truck, and the pride of knowing I'd been able to give him that gift. But now, looking back on that moment, I realized how blind I was, how utterly unprepared. What could happen? It was my father. It was my wife. Two people I trusted more than anyone. What was Cap there to question? If only I had known then. If only I'd felt even the faintest stir of unease. But instead, I stood outside in the fading sun, believing the day had been perfect, never suspecting that everything was about to change. The afternoon had drifted into early evening, and I was still in the yard with my grandfather, who hadn't stopped talking about the trucks inside handed him the keys. Every few minutes, his eyes would flick over to it, parked proudly by the house as if he still couldn't believe it was real. It felt good, seeing him like this, happier than I'd seen him in years. I was immersed in the moment, caught up in the pride of having made this day memorable for him, when suddenly a sharp scream tore through the air. The sound froze me, my grandmother's voice shrill, filled with a mix of horror and disbelief. "What do you think you're doing? How can you do this here?" I looked at my grandfather, but he was just as stunned, his face pale as we both turned toward the house. I ran, my heart pounding, as I moved through the door, down the narrow hallway, toward the source of the commotion. Then I saw it, the door to the bedroom slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hall. Inside, I caught the hurried sounds of movement, the rustle of clothes. I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. I pushed the door open, and there they were. My wife and my father, both caught in a scene that shattered everything in an instant. She was tugging her dress back, over her shoulders, her cheeks flushed, hair tousled, and he stood beside her, frozen, still in his underwear, his eyes wide with the horror of having been caught. My mind went blank, numb by the sheer weight of what I was seeing. This was supposed to be a day of family, of celebration. Yet here they were, both of them, looking back at me with faces that held no explanations, no excuses, just the empty shock of being exposed. A low, raw sound tore from my throat as I charged forward, grabbing my father by the hair, my hands shaking with a fury I could hardly contain. "How could you? How could you do this to me?" I spat the words, each one heavy with a betrayal sinking into my gut like a knife. He just looked at me, his face a twisted mask of shame and confusion, but he didn't say anything. Maybe there was nothing he could say. I turned to my wife, who had her arms folded around herself. Her head hung low as she pulled her dress back, in place, silent and unmoving. She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't offer a single word to make sense of this, to explain why she'd done something so unforgivable. My voice shook as I shouted at her, demanding answers, demanding anything that could make this feel less like a nightmare. But she said nothing. She just stood there, staring back at me with those eyes that once looked at me with love and loyalty, now empty and hollow, offering no hint of regret, no explanation. I was left standing there, surrounded by the crumbling remains of trust, loyalty, and everything I thought I'd built with them. The silence between us was louder than any scream, and in that silence, I felt everything I had known, everything I had believed, fall away, leaving me standing alone. The weight of what had just happened sat heavy in the air, pressing down on me, suffocating. I could feel every set of eyes on me, watching the ruin of what was supposed to be a perfect day. I turned, and there was my grandfather standing just behind me, his face pale, his shoulders slumped, as he looked at my father with an expression that was more than disappointment. It was a kind of deep, weary shame. "I don't know where I went wrong," he murmured, his voice raw. "I'm ashamed to have raised a son who could do something like this." He turned his gaze to me, and I felt the depth of his sorrow, his regret. It was as if everything he'd built, every value he'd instilled, had been ripped away, shattered in front of him. Behind him, the guests from the party gathered, standing in stunned silence, whispering to each other, their faces reflecting the shock, the disbelief. I felt exposed, as if every private part of my life had been laid out for them to judge. It was like the floor had dropped out from under me, and all that remained was a chasm of betrayal. Then, in that bitter silence, my wife finally spoke. Her voice was cold, defensive, almost unbothered. "Your father wanted it," she said, as if that alone excused everything. Her words struck me like a slap, and a surge of rage rose within me, searing through the sorrow and humiliation. I screamed, raw and uncontrolled, the sound tearing through the air. "I hate you." My voice cracked, filled with every ounce of pain, betrayal, and anger I'd felt since the moment I stepped into that room. "I hate you, all of you." It felt like I was imploding, every feeling building to an unbearable pressure until I could hardly breathe. I turned away, blind to everything but the need to escape. My hand found the keys to my grandfather's pickup, the same truck that had been the centerpiece of today's celebration. Without another thought, I ran to it, throwing myself inside, my heart pounding as I started the engine and tore out of the driveway. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. All I knew was that I needed to get away from the faces, the memories, and the betrayal. The truck roared down the empty desert road, the sun setting in a wash of blood red and purple over the distant horizon. I drove, faster than I should have, the fury and heartbreak twisting inside me, propelling me forward, away from everything I had known. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the scene replaying in my mind, their faces, the words my grandfather's disappointed eyes. Everything haunted me, refusing to let go. Then out of nowhere it happened. I felt the tires slip, the truck veering off the road as I fought for control. But it was too late. The truck spun, the world tilting as I felt it tip, flip, and crash. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and I felt myself tossed like a rag doll as the truck finally came to a stop, crumpled and broken on the side of the highway. When the world stilled, I felt a wave of numbness, a dull pain throbbing somewhere deep inside. I looked around, dazed, the wreckage surrounding me. My grandfather's truck, once a symbol of everything I had wanted to give him, was destroyed. The guilt settled in, sharp and deep. I hadn't wanted it to end like this, hadn't wanted to ruin the one thing that had been good about today. I choked back a sob, the frustration, anger, and despair all pressing down until the tears fell, freely. Then through the haze, I saw headlights in the distance growing larger, brighter. The outline of a car pulled closer, and I realized it was mine, the same car I'd left back in my grandfather's. I squinted, trying to make out who was driving. It was either my father or my grandfather. I couldn't tell until the door opened, and my grandfather's familiar figure stepped out. His face strained with worry as he rushed over. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with those sad, concerned eyes, scanning me up and down as he placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, calm, even though everything between us felt shattered. Something in me cracked, a deep, desperate need for comfort, breaking through the walls of anger and pain. I ran toward him, letting the tears fall as I grabbed onto him, burying my face in his shoulder. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it all poured out as he held me. And for a moment, despite everything, I felt like a child again, safe in his arms. The drive back was silent, save for the low rumble of the engine and the occasional stifled sob I couldn't keep in. I sat there, my head resting against the window, watching the darkened desert pass by, the broken outlines of rocks and scrub brushing past like memories I wanted to forget. The guilt sat like a weight in my chest, and every few minutes, a new wave of anger and shame washed over me until I couldn't hold it back. I didn't want this. I muttered, my voice breaking. I saw my grandfather's face, lit only by the headlights, his eyes focused forward, but his mouth set in a grim line, his disappointment to quiet weight between us. "You know, we can fix the truck," he said after a long pause, but his voice was tired, and I could hear the hurt in it, like this wasn't just about the truck, but something deeper, something he knew we couldn't fix. "It's not about the truck," I said, my voice raw. It's all of it. She cheated on me, my own father. I don't understand how they could do this to me." My voice rose almost a shout, and I pounded my fists on the seat, the rage boiling over until I was shouting into the darkness. Why? Why would she do this? Why would he do this? My grandfather stayed quiet, his eyes ahead, his hands gripping the wheel as he listened. After a while, he spoke, his voice low and distant. "It's not easy, but I know what you're feeling," he said. "I've been through it too. Not the same, but close enough to know that sometimes people are not who we think they are. You give them everything, and they still find a way to betray you. I looked at him shocked. I had never known this about him, had never imagined my grandfather, a man who had stood strong through everything a man I looked up to had ever faced something like this. You can't change what's done. He continued, his voice soft but unyielding. It'll burn at you. It'll tear you up. But at some point, you'll have to accept that there's nothing more you can do. That's just how it is. His words hit me like a hammer, a harsh truth I wasn't ready to face. I wanted to fight, to do something to make sense of the betrayal. But as I sat there, the emptiness inside me only deepened, like the truth he spoke was sinking in, whether I wanted it to or not. I felt drained, hollow, the fire of my anger fading to a dull ache. When we finally pulled into the driveway, the house loomed dark and silent. I got out and walked toward the front door with a single purpose in my mind. I wasn't going to let her presence haunt this place, not tonight. I went straight to the hallway where our photos hung, each one a reminder of promises broken and lies I hadn't seen. One by one, I tore them down, my hands shaking as I threw them to the floor, each frame shattering like a memory breaking apart. I moved through the house, taking everything that had her touch, her scent, every piece of her that had once made this place feel like a home, and tossed it into a pile, clothing, letters, gifts, souvenirs of a life that was now just an illusion. My grandfather watched from the doorway, his face a mixture of sadness and quiet resignation. I could feel his disappointment still, but he didn't say a word. He knew I needed to purge every reminder, every trace of her from my life. She'll never set foot here. Again, I said, my voice shaking with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut. I wanted her, gone, erased, as if that would somehow make the hurt go away. But as I looked around at the empty walls and the house stripped bare, I realized that getting rid of her things didn't fill the hollow space she'd left inside me. The anger was there, burning hot, but beneath it was something darker, a grief I wasn't ready to face. My grandfather nodded, understanding. This won't be easy, he said quietly, but I'll be here. Whatever you need. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch steady, grounding me, even as everything else in my life spun out of control. And for the first time since the day began, I felt the faintest glimmer of stability. The first night after I'd thrown her out was raw and empty. I stayed with my grandfather, the house feeling strangely quiet, as if everything I'd left behind had been hollowed out. The next morning, I steeled myself and called her, letting the phone ring until her voice came through, shaky and small, like she already knew what was coming. Don't come back, I told her, my voice cold and steady. This isn't your home anymore. You don't belong here. She broke down immediately. Her words tangled with sobs as she tried to explain, to apologize, to tell me how much of a mistake she'd made. Her voice was pleading, thick with her grit, but all I felt was the bitterness, a wall of resentment too high for any apology to cross. You should have thought about that before, I said, and without another word, I hung up, silencing the sound of her crying, her excuses. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want any part of her in my life. The days that followed were a blur of anger, sadness, and an emptiness that nothing could seem to fill. But I stayed close to my grandfather, who didn't press me with questions or reminders, just offered me his quiet presence, steady and unchanging. We spent our time working on the truck, repairing the dents and damage from the crash. At first, it was just something to keep my hands busy, something to focus on, other than the void my life had become. But as the truck began to take shape again, so did a sense of purpose. Each bolt, each piece put back in place, felt like a step forward, a piece of my old self returning. Then one day she showed up. I was in the driveway, focused on the truck's engine. When I saw her figure coming up the road, she looked different, worn, her face drawn and tense, her steps slow as if she expected me to turn her away before she reached the house. I could feel the anger stirring in my chest, but I kept my eyes on the truck, the tools in my hands steady. I came to get my things, she said, her voice low, subdued. I glanced at her briefly, a flat, detached look that I could see stung her. They're gone, I said, returning to my work. Everything's in the trash. Her eyes flared, with anger then, her posture stiffening as she glared at me. For a moment I thought she'd lunge at me, that she'd finally let loose the bitterness I knew was churning inside her. But she held back, biting down her frustration until her mouth formed a tight, thin line. You think that makes this right? She said, her voice seething. You think throwing everything away changes what happened? I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed on the engine. Nothing can change what happened. I replied, my voice even calmed, and I don't want anything from you left here. Not now, not ever. I expected her to shout, to argue, to try to push her way back into my life. But instead, she just stood there for a moment. Her face flushed with anger, her eyes sharp with the resentment. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me with only the sound of her footsteps fading down the driveway. I exhaled, my hands trembling slightly. As I picked up the wrench again, the tension finally beginning to loosen. My grandfather, who had been watching silently from the garage, walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. You did well, he said quietly. Sometimes moving on means letting go, even when it's hard. The work continued, the truck slowly returning to life, each new repair bringing a small sense of relief. As the days passed, I felt the pain begin to dull, felt a sense of acceptance settle in. My grandfather's quiet presence was an anchor, something to hold on to all the rest of my life, reoriented itself around this new reality. Finally, the truck was finished. We stepped back to admire, and I could see a look of pride in my grandfather's eyes as he patted the hood. It wasn't just a truck anymore. It was a symbol, a testament to moving forward, to piecing things back together, even after everything had fallen apart. A few days later, my grandfather went back home, his job done, his guidance, leaving me with a strength I hadn't known I had. I stood there, looking at my house, once filled with warmth, with dreams I thought would last a lifetime. But those dreams were gone now, replaced by a hard, one clarity, a determination to start over. I made up my mind right then. I would sell the house, rid myself of this place that now held only memories I wanted to leave behind. A new life was waiting for me, one that didn't have to carry the weight of everything I'd lost. With one last look at the house, I walked back to the truck, ready to move forward, ready to leave it all behind. The sale of the house went through last month. By then, I thought I'd left everything behind. The memories, the betrayal, they felt like ghosts from a past life, haunting but fading. I was already looking ahead, thinking of a new life waiting for me in California, a life far away from the hurt, the anger, and the pieces of myself that I'd had to leave behind to survive. But then the call came. It was late, and I was still packing, sorting through what few things I was taking with me when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first, but something told me to answer. I almost didn't. I almost let it go to voicemail, figuring it was just another update on the house. But when I picked up, I heard her voice. The voice I thought I'd never hear again. She sounded strange, hesitant, almost afraid. I know you don't want to hear from me. She started, her words slow, heavy, but you need to know something. I waited, my pulse pounding as she took a shaky breath. I'm pregnant. She said, her voice barely a whisper. The words hit like a gut punch. My mind reeling as I tried to process what she just said. But before I could respond, she added, it's not yours, it's your father's. Everything went silent. Her words echoed in my mind, and for a second, it felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I wanted a scream to shout, to ask her how she could say something so twisted, so brutal, but instead all I could do was stand there, frozen, as a cold numbness crept over me. How could you? I finally managed my voice barely a whisper. I could feel the weight of it all, pressing down on me. The betrayal, the loss, now a permanent reminder in the form of a child that would tie her and my father together forever. It was as if I'd been blindsided all over again. The wound I tried so hard to heal ripped open, raw and bleeding. I didn't plan for this. She said, her voice breaking. I don't know how this happened. Your father, he's as shocked as you are. I just thought you should know. I wanted to throw the phone to erase this moment, to go back to a time before her words shattered what little peace I'd managed to find. But I just ended the call, letting the silence hang in the air, trying to push the weight of it all back down. For the rest of the night, her words haunted me, replaying over and over until they felt like some twisted nightmare I couldn't escape. I didn't sleep. I just sat there in the dark, feeling the weight of a betrayal that now felt deeper than anything I could have imagined. By morning, I was hollow. The anger and shock burned out, leaving only a bitter emptiness. But I made a choice then. I had already made the decision to leave, to let go of the life that had hurt me so deeply. This would just be another thing I'd leave behind, another ghost I'd refuse to carry. So I went to California, carrying only what I needed, leaving the rest in the past. I started fresh, building a new life, one that didn't carry the weight of betrayal or anger. The memories still lingered. Yes, creeping up in the quiet hours, a shadow I'd have to live, but out there, far from the wreckage of my old life, I could breathe again. I knew that someday, maybe the wounds would finally heal. Until then, I would live. I would find peace in the life I was, building one step one day at a time. California was waiting, and with each passing day, the grip of wool, the past loosened, fading into the distance like a bad dream left far behind.